She was standing outside the admissions office of Harvard University, holding a folder that contained her entire life. Her name was Maya Richardson, and she was 26 years old, which meant she'd spent 6 of those years inside a prison cell for a crime she'd committed when she was too young and too desperate to understand the consequences. The folder in her hands contained her high school transcripts from 15 years ago. Grades that weren't impressive because she'd been dealing with an alcoholic mother and unstable housing. It contained her GED certificate, earned in prison during the first year of her sentence. It contained letters of recommendation from the prison chaplain and the prison librarian. It contained essays about second chances and redemption and the transformative power of education. It did not contain the kind of credentials that Harvard typically looked for. Before we start this story, I need you to do something for me. Leave a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. Tell me what you think about second chances and whether you believe people deserve them. And at the very end of the story, I need you to rate it from 0 to 10. Because this is not just a story about a woman overcoming her circumstances. This is a story about systemic injustice and whether institutions like Harvard are actually committed to diversity or just to the performance of diversity. This is a story about what happens when someone refuses to accept that their past determines their future. This is the story of Maya Richardson, a woman who was told no by everyone except one person who said yes. Let's find out what that one yes changed. Maya Richardson had been born in Detroit to a mother who struggled with addiction and a father who'd never been present. She'd grown up in poverty, moving between different apartments and sometimes homeless shelters. She'd gone to schools that were underfunded and understaffed. She'd had teachers who cared but were overwhelmed. She'd had counselors who meant well but had caseloads so large they couldn't actually help anyone. By the time she was 16 years old, Maya had learned that the world wasn't designed for people like her. The world wasn't designed for poor black girls whose mothers couldn't get sober. The world wasn't designed for people without connections or resources or social capital. The world was designed for people who were born into advantage, and everyone else had to figure out how to survive in the margins. At 16, Maya had made a choice that would define the next decade of her life. She'd gotten involved with a group of people who were involved in drug distribution. She'd thought it was temporary. She'd thought it was just until she could save enough money to get out. She'd thought a lot of things that turned out to be naive. At 18 years old, Maya was arrested for possession with intent to distribute. She was convicted and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. She was a black woman in the criminal justice system, which meant her sentence was longer than it would have been if she'd been white. It meant her appeals were taken less seriously. It meant nobody was particularly invested in her rehabilitation. But Maya was invested in her own rehabilitation. During the first year of her sentence, she'd had a breakdown. She'd sat in her cell and she'd understood with absolute clarity that she'd thrown away her life. She'd understood that she was going to be in prison for years. She'd understood that when she got out, she was going to be a felon with a criminal record and no job prospects and no future. And she'd decided that if she was going to spend years in prison anyway, she might as well use that time to actually become someone different. She'd started reading. The prison library had limited resources, but what it had, Maya consumed. She read novels and philosophy and history and biography. She read about people who'd overcome adversity. She read about systems of oppression and how they worked. She read about education as a tool for liberation. She'd earned her GED in the prison school program. She'd taken every educational class that was available to her. She'd worked as a tutor, helping other inmates learn to read. She'd worked as a peer counselor, helping women navigate the trauma of incarceration. By the time she was released from prison at 24 years old, Maya was a fundamentally different person from the 18-year-old who'd been arrested. But society didn't see that. Society saw a formerly incarcerated black woman with a felony conviction and no prospects. She'd tried to find work. She'd applied to hundreds of jobs. She'd been turned down by most of them the moment they ran her background check. The few jobs that had hired her were minimum wage positions with no benefits and no future. She'd worked as a cashier. She'd worked as a custodian. She'd worked as a home health aide. It had been hard. The work had been exhausting and demeaning and had paid barely enough for her to afford a small apartment and food. But Maya had kept thinking about education. She'd kept thinking that if she could somehow get into a college, any college, she might be able to build a different future. She'd applied to community colleges. She'd been accepted to one. She'd spent 2 years taking community college courses while working full-time. She'd gotten straight A's. She'd written essays about her experience. She'd built relationships with her professors. She'd done everything right. And then she'd made a decision that most people would have thought was insane. She'd decided to apply to Harvard. Not to Harvard Law School or Harvard Business School. Those would have been slightly more realistic. She'd decided to apply for admission to Harvard College as an undergraduate transfer student. She'd decided to apply to one of the most prestigious universities in the world with a criminal record, without family wealth, without legacy connections, without any of the things that typically get people into Harvard. Her friends had thought she was delusional. Her coworkers had laughed at her. Her family had gently suggested that she was setting herself up for disappointment. But Maya had filled out the application. She'd written essays about her experience, about what she'd learned in prison, about why Harvard was where she wanted to finish her education. She'd submitted the application, knowing it was probably a waste of time, but also knowing that if she didn't try, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what if. The rejection letters came back within a few weeks. Harvard sent her a polite but firm rejection. "While we appreciate your perseverance and your academic achievements," the letter said, "we receive thousands of applications from highly qualified candidates, and we are only able to admit a small percentage of them. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." The letter was a standard rejection letter. It didn't account for the fact that she was a formerly incarcerated black woman. It didn't acknowledge the extraordinary obstacles she'd overcome. It didn't recognize that her straight A's in community college, earned while working full-time as a home health aide, were arguably more impressive than the straight A's of a privileged student who'd had tutors and test prep and family support. Maya had read the rejection letter and she'd felt the familiar sensation of the world closing in on her again. She'd felt the sensation of doors being slammed in her face. She'd felt the sensation of being told that no matter what she did, no matter how hard she worked, she would never be good enough. She would never escape her past. She would always be the girl from Detroit with the criminal record. She'd sat with that feeling for a few days. Then she'd done something that surprised herself. She'd called Harvard. She'd looked up the number for the admissions office and she'd called it. When the receptionist had asked what she was calling about, Maya had said, "I'd like to speak to someone about my rejection from Harvard. I was recently rejected for transfer admission, and I have some questions about the decision." She'd been transferred to an admissions counselor, a young woman named Rebecca who'd sounded slightly annoyed at the interruption. "I'm looking at your application," Rebecca had said. "Your academic credentials are good, but Harvard receives applications from students with similar academic records from much more prestigious institutions. Your community college coursework, while commendable, doesn't have the same weight as coursework from a 4-year institution." "I understand that," Maya had said, her voice steady. "But I want to know if my criminal record played a role in the decision. I want to know if you would have admitted me if I didn't have a felony conviction." There had been a long silence on the other end of the line. "That's not something I can really discuss," Rebecca had said finally. "Can you connect me with someone who can?" Maya had asked. She'd been transferred to someone in the Office of Admissions. That person had told her that individual decisions couldn't be discussed. She'd been transferred to the Dean of Admissions. That person had been out of the office. Maya had left a message. She hadn't expected anyone to call her back. She'd expected that to be the end of it. But she'd been wrong. 3 days later, her phone rang. The caller ID said, Harvard University. Maya's heart had started racing. "Is this Maya Richardson?" A man's voice had asked. "Yes," Maya had said. "This is Dean William Foster from Harvard College," the man had said. "I received your message. I wanted to talk to you about your application." Dean William Foster was the dean of Harvard College. He was not someone who typically called prospective students. He was not someone who typically involved himself in individual admissions decisions. But for some reason, he had decided to call Maya. "I've read your application carefully," Dean Foster had said. I've read your essays. I've read your community college transcripts. I've read the letters of recommendation from the prison chaplain and the prison librarian. And I want to tell you something. I think the admissions committee made a mistake. Maya's hands had started shaking. I think, Dean Foster had continued, that we rejected you not because you weren't qualified, but because we were afraid. We were afraid of what your presence on our campus might mean. We were afraid of having to confront the fact that our institution has historically excluded people like you. We were afraid of what it would look like to admit a formerly incarcerated black woman when we could admit someone with a more conventional background who would make us feel less uncomfortable about our own complicity in systems of oppression. Maya hadn't known what to say. So here's what I'm going to do, Dean Foster had said. I'm going to override the admissions committee's decision. I'm going to admit you to Harvard College. And I'm going to personally make sure that you have the support you need to succeed here. Because I think you're exactly the kind of student that Harvard should be educating. Maya had cried. She'd cried while sitting in her small apartment, holding her phone, listening to the dean of Harvard College tell her that she was being admitted. She'd cried because for the first time in her life, someone in a position of real power had looked at her past and had decided it didn't disqualify her from the future. The news spread quickly. Within days, local news stations had picked up the story. Former inmate admitted to Harvard, the headline said. Dean overrides admissions committee to admit formerly incarcerated student. Against all odds, woman overcomes criminal record to get into Harvard. But the story had also spread in darker ways. On social media, people had attacked Dean Foster. They'd said that he was lowering Harvard standards. They'd said that admitting a formerly incarcerated woman was a betrayal of the institution's legacy. They'd said that he was being politically correct and making decisions based on identity politics rather than merit. Some of the harshest criticism had come from Harvard alumni and current students. A petition had been started calling for Dean Foster's removal. Conservative commentators had used Maya's admission as an example of woke culture run amok. But Dean Foster hadn't backed down. In an interview, he'd said something that would become famous. The question we need to ask ourselves is not whether Maya Richardson belongs at Harvard. The question we need to ask ourselves is whether Harvard belongs in a society that has systematically denied opportunity to people like Maya Richardson. The question we need to ask ourselves is whether an institution that claims to be committed to excellence can justify excluding someone who has demonstrated extraordinary resilience, determination, and intellectual capacity. Maya Richardson didn't need Harvard to admit her because she's black. She needed Harvard to admit her because she's brilliant. And if we can't see that, then we've failed in our fundamental mission as an educational institution. Maya had started at Harvard in the fall. She'd moved into a dorm room that was nicer than any place she'd ever lived. She'd walked into classrooms and had seen students who'd been born into privilege in ways she couldn't even imagine. She'd sat in lectures with professors who were experts in their fields. She'd felt, for the first time in her life, like she actually belonged somewhere. But it hadn't been easy. Other students had known about her background. They'd known that she was formerly incarcerated. Some of them had treated her with suspicion. Some had treated her with pity. Some had treated her like she was a diversity admit, not a legitimate student. Maya had learned to navigate this. She'd kept her head down. She'd worked harder than everyone around her. She'd gotten straight A's. She'd started working with a group of other formerly incarcerated students who were in higher education. She'd started writing about her experience. She'd started building a life that looked nothing like the life she'd been told she would have. By her third semester, she'd changed her major to criminal justice policy. She'd decided that she wanted to work on reforming the system that had incarcerated her. She'd decided that she wanted to help other people like her. People with criminal records who wanted to pursue education and build different futures. During her second year at Harvard, Maya was invited to speak at a panel about mass incarceration and second chances. The panel was being held at the Kennedy School of Government. There would be professors, policy experts, formerly incarcerated individuals, and family members of incarcerated people. Maya had agreed to speak. She'd written her remarks. She'd practiced them multiple times. She'd been nervous, but she'd also been ready. The panel was held on a Friday afternoon. The room was packed with about 200 people. There were reporters from major news outlets. There were professors from the law school and the Kennedy School. There were formerly incarcerated people and their families. When it was Maya's turn to speak, she'd stood up and she'd told her story. She'd told them about growing up in poverty in Detroit. She'd told them about her mother's addiction. She'd told them about turning to drug distribution as a way to survive. She'd told them about being arrested and convicted and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. But she'd also told them about what had changed everything. She'd told them about discovering education in prison. She'd told them about the chaplain and the librarian who'd believed in her. She'd told them about being released and struggling to find work because of her record. She'd told them about community college and straight A's. She'd told them about applying to Harvard thinking it was impossible. She'd told them about Dean Foster's decision to override the admissions committee. "And here I am," she'd said, "standing in front of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, a formerly incarcerated black woman from Detroit, speaking to you about criminal justice reform. And I'm here not because I'm special or because I'm an exception. I'm here because one person, Dean William Foster, decided to see past the label of formerly incarcerated and see the human being and the student and the future that I could be." She'd paused. "But I'm also here," she'd continued, "to tell you that I shouldn't be an exception. There are thousands of people in this country who have the intellectual capacity to attend Harvard. There are thousands of people with criminal records who have the determination and the resilience to succeed in college. And we're not giving them the chance because we're afraid. We're afraid of what it means about our society. We're afraid of what it means about the systems we've built. We're afraid to acknowledge that the criminal justice system is fundamentally unjust and that it disproportionately impacts black people and poor people." The room had been completely silent. "We need to change that," Maya had said. "We need institutions like Harvard to actively recruit and support formerly incarcerated students. We need to stop treating criminal records as a permanent disqualification for opportunity. We need to recognize that a person who has served their time deserves the chance to rebuild their life. Because if we don't do that, we're just continuing the cycle of incarceration and poverty and despair that has defined American criminal justice for centuries." When she'd finished speaking, the room had erupted in applause. But Maya had also seen some people sitting in the audience with their arms crossed, their expressions suggesting they disagreed with everything she'd just said. After the panel, reporters had crowded around Maya with microphones and cameras. They'd asked her how it felt to be at Harvard. They'd asked her what she wanted to do after she graduated. They'd asked her if she had a message for other formerly incarcerated people. "I want to tell them," Maya had said to the reporters, "that your past doesn't have to be your future. That no matter what you've done, no matter where you've been, if you're willing to do the work, you can rebuild your life. And I want to tell society that we need to be willing to give people second chances. We need to be willing to see beyond the label of criminal and see the human being. Because when we do that, we discover that some of those people are going to change the world." News of Maya's speech spread. It was covered by major media outlets. It was shared on social media. It became part of the national conversation about criminal justice reform and second chances. And something unexpected happened. Donations to Harvard's scholarship fund for formerly incarcerated students increased dramatically. Other universities started creating similar programs. Companies started changing their hiring practices to remove automatic disqualifications for people with criminal records. Dean Foster had become something of a celebrity in progressive circles. He'd been invited to speak at conferences about criminal justice reform. He'd been featured in magazine articles about innovative approaches to higher education. He'd been nominated for humanitarian awards. But what he'd said in an interview stuck with Maya. He'd been asked if he regretted admitting her. "I regret that it was controversial," he'd said. "I regret that there were people who believed that admitting a qualified student with a criminal record was somehow a betrayal of Harvard standards. But I don't regret the decision itself. Because Maya is exactly the kind of student that Harvard should be educating. She's exactly the kind of student that any university should be educating. And if we can't see that, then we've failed in our fundamental mission." Maya graduated from Harvard with highest honors. Her thesis was on the intersection of criminal justice reform and education access. It was published in an academic journal. She was awarded a fellowship to study criminal justice policy at a think tank in Washington, D.C. But before she started her fellowship, she'd gone back to Detroit. She'd gone back to the neighborhood where she'd grown up. She'd gone back to the high school she'd attended. She'd spoken to students about her journey. She'd told them that it was possible. She'd told them that the circumstances of their birth didn't have to determine the circumstances of their life. And a young girl had raised her hand and asked her a question that had stayed with her. "Did you ever think," the girl had asked, "that you were going to make it?" Maya had thought about that question. She'd thought about the years in prison. She'd thought about the difficulty of finding work after her release. She'd thought about the rejection from Harvard. She'd thought about all the moments when she could have given up and accepted the narrative that society had written for her. "No," she'd said honestly. "I didn't think I was going to make it. But I decided to try anyway. And that's all that any of us can really do. We can decide to try. We can decide to believe in ourselves even when nobody else believes in us. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we meet someone like Dean Foster who decides to believe in us too." 5 years after graduating from Harvard, Maya had started her own nonprofit organization. The organization was called Second Chances, and its mission was to support formerly incarcerated individuals in pursuing higher education. The organization provided scholarships, mentorship, and career support. The organization had helped hundreds of people. Many of them had gone to college. Some had gone to elite universities. Some had gone to less prestigious institutions. But all of them had been given the opportunity that Maya had been given. The opportunity to prove that their past didn't have to determine their future. Maya had also become a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform. She'd testified before Congress. She'd written op-eds in major newspapers. She'd been interviewed by national media outlets. She'd become the face of second chances for formerly incarcerated people. And Dean Foster had remained her mentor and her friend. They'd stayed in touch throughout her years at Harvard and beyond. He'd supported her nonprofit. He'd written letters of recommendation for her. He'd been present at major moments in her career. In an interview, when asked what it meant to her that Dean Foster had taken a chance on her, Maya had said something that captured the essence of their relationship. "It meant everything," she'd said. "It meant that I wasn't just a felony. I wasn't just a statistic about black women in the criminal justice system. I was a human being with potential. I was someone worthy of investment. I was someone capable of growth and change. That one decision to override the admissions committee, that one decision changed not just my life, but the lives of hundreds of other people who have been able to access education through the work I've done because I was given that opportunity." 10 years after her admission to Harvard, Maya was invited back to speak at the university's graduation ceremony. She was the commencement speaker. She spoke to thousands of students who were graduating from the world's most prestigious university. "You are graduating from Harvard," she'd said to them, "into a world that is deeply unjust. You are graduating into a world where the circumstances of your birth largely determine the circumstances of your life. You are graduating into a world where if you're poor or black or formerly incarcerated or all of the above, the doors are largely closed to you. But you are also graduating from a place that, in recent years, has started to acknowledge that those doors need to be opened." She'd looked out at the crowd of students and their families. "When I was in prison," she'd said, "I didn't think I was ever going to be standing on a stage like this. I didn't think I was ever going to graduate from college. I didn't think I was ever going to have the kind of life that I have now. But one person, Dean William Foster, decided to see past my criminal record and see my potential. And that one decision changed everything." She'd pointed to Dean Foster, who was sitting on the stage. "And so my message to you," she'd said, "is to be like Dean Foster. Be the person who sees potential where others see only disqualification. Be the person who opens doors. Be the person who believes in second chances. Because when you do that, you don't just change one person's life. You change the world." The crowd had stood and applauded. But Maya hadn't finished. She'd held up her hand asking for silence. And she'd continued speaking. But I also want to be honest with you, she'd said. I want to tell you the truth about what it's been like to be here. I want to tell you about the conversations I've overheard in dining halls where students have discussed whether I really deserve to be here. I want to tell you about the emails I received from alumni telling Dean Foster that admitting me was a betrayal of Harvard's legacy. I want to tell you about the moment when I was sitting in a class and a student turned to me and asked, "So how much did you have to pay to get in here?" As if my admission couldn't possibly have been based on merit. The crowd had shifted uncomfortably. Some people had looked down. Some had looked angry. These moments happened, Maya had continued. These moments of doubt and skepticism and prejudice happened. And I want to acknowledge that because I think it's important that we don't pretend that admitting a formerly incarcerated person to Harvard somehow magically erased racism or classism or the tendency to see people like me as less than. She'd paused, letting that sink in. But I'm also here to tell you, she'd continued, that those moments didn't stop me. Those moments made me stronger. Because I'd spent 8 years in prison. I'd faced actual institutional racism and classism and brutality. A dismissive comment from a privileged student couldn't break me. A skeptical look from an alumni couldn't break me. Because I'd already survived things that were infinitely worse. And that's something I think is important for people who have never faced systemic oppression to understand, Maya had said, her voice getting stronger. It's important to understand that the barriers that we create for people, the barriers of prejudice and discrimination and the refusal to give people second chances, those barriers don't just inconvenience people. Those barriers destroy lives. Those barriers create cycles of poverty and incarceration and despair that ripple through generations. She'd looked directly at the camera, knowing that this speech was being recorded and would be watched by thousands of people. I was incarcerated because I was desperate, she'd said. I was desperate because I grew up in poverty in a city where opportunities were limited. I was desperate because my mother was addicted to drugs and my father had abandoned us. I was desperate because the systems that were supposed to help me, the schools, the social services, the community resources, those systems were so underfunded and so overwhelmed that they couldn't actually help anyone. She'd paused. But here's what I want you to understand, she'd continued. My desperation was not unique. There are thousands of people in this country who are in similar situations right now. There are young people in Detroit and Chicago and Baltimore and everywhere else who are facing the same choices I faced. And we're telling them the same thing society told me, that their options are limited. That their future is predetermined by the circumstances of their birth. So what I'm asking you, Maya had said to the graduating class, is to do something different. I'm asking you to be the people who change that. I'm asking you to use the privilege of a Harvard education not just for yourselves, but for the people who didn't get that education. I'm asking you to work toward a world where a young person in Detroit doesn't feel like they have to turn to drug dealing to survive. I'm asking you to work toward a world where people who make mistakes, people who commit crimes because they're desperate, are given genuine second chances instead of being permanently cast aside. She'd stepped forward on the stage, her voice becoming more passionate. You have so much power, she'd said to the graduates. You have the power that comes from a Harvard education. You have the power that comes from the networks you've built here. You have the power that comes from the resources you have access to. And I'm asking you to use that power responsibly. I'm asking you to remember that for every person sitting in this audience, there are dozens of people who wanted to be here but couldn't afford it. For every person who got in on their first try, there are dozens who were rejected. For every person who had families who supported their education, there are dozens who had to figure it out alone. And I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty, Maya had continued. I'm saying this to remind you that you've been given something extraordinary. You've been given access to one of the best educations in the world. You've been given the opportunity to study with some of the greatest minds in their fields. You've been given the opportunity to be part of a network that will support you for the rest of your life. And that's not something that everyone gets. She'd paused, collecting herself. When I was in prison, she'd said, I read a book by a sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu. He wrote about something called cultural capital. He argued that the reason people from wealthy families tend to succeed is not just because they have money. It's because they have cultural capital. They have the knowledge of how institutions work. They have the connections to people in positions of power. They have the confidence that comes from growing up in spaces where people like them belong. She'd looked out at the audience. And that's what Harvard gives you, she'd said. Harvard gives you cultural capital. Harvard gives you the knowledge that you belong in spaces of power. Harvard gives you connections to people who can help you get where you want to go. And that's incredibly valuable. That's life-changing. But that value is magnified when you use it to help other people access the same opportunities. So here's what I'm asking you to commit to, Maya had said. I'm asking you to commit to mentoring people who don't come from privileged backgrounds. I'm asking you to commit to hiring people with criminal records. I'm asking you to commit to supporting criminal justice reform. I'm asking you to commit to using your Harvard degree to build a more just world. She'd stepped back, her eyes scanning the crowd. And I'm also asking you to commit to confronting your own biases, she'd continued. I'm asking you to examine the moments when you make assumptions about people based on their appearance or their background. I'm asking you to recognize that the systems we've built are designed to benefit people like many of you and to exclude people like me. And I'm asking you to actively work to change those systems. Because here's the truth, she'd said. The truth is that I shouldn't be remarkable. The truth is that a formerly incarcerated black woman graduating from Harvard shouldn't be a news story. The truth is that it shouldn't take a dean willing to override the admissions committee for someone like me to get a chance. The truth is that if we were doing things right, people like me would be getting into Harvard all the time. We would be so common that nobody would think twice about it. She'd stepped back from the microphone slightly, collecting herself, her eyes scanning the crowd one more time. But we're not there yet, she'd said quietly. And we won't get there until people who have power decide to use that power to help other people access power. The auditorium had fallen completely silent. Even the shuffling of feet and the rustling of papers had stopped. After the ceremony, Dean Foster had pulled Maya aside privately. That was the most important commencement speech I've heard in my 30 years at Harvard, he'd said. You changed people today. You made them uncomfortable, and that's exactly what they needed. They'd sat together in his office, and he'd told her something she didn't know. When I first read your application, he'd said, I almost didn't look at it carefully. I almost just let the admissions committee's decision stand. But something made me read it. Something made me see past the criminal record. And the more I read, the more I realized that we were making a mistake. We were rejecting you not because you weren't qualified, but because we were afraid of what you represented. What did I represent? Maya had asked. You represented a challenge to everything we believe about merit, Dean Foster had said. You represented the reality that our admissions process, the process we're so proud of, is actually selecting for privilege, not for potential. You represented the reality that there are brilliant people out there who we're rejecting simply because they don't have the right background. And I think that scared the committee. It scared them because it meant they would have to acknowledge their own complicity in systems of inequality. He'd paused. But you didn't let me be scared, he'd continued. You didn't let me hide behind policy and procedure. You called the office and you asked questions. You demanded to know why. And that courage, that refusal to accept no, that's when I knew I had to do something different. Years later, when Maya was being interviewed for a documentary about second chances and criminal justice reform, she'd been asked about that moment when she called Harvard. I was terrified, she'd admitted. I was terrified that I would call and they would hang up on me. I was terrified that I would make things worse. I was terrified that I was being arrogant for even trying. But I was also angry. I was angry that they'd rejected me. I was angry that they'd looked at my application and decided I didn't belong. I was angry that nobody seemed to think it was worth explaining why. She'd looked directly at the camera. And that anger, she'd continued, became fuel. That anger became the thing that made me pick up the phone. That anger became the thing that made me believe I deserved an explanation. Because I did deserve an explanation. I'd done the work. I'd earned the grades. I'd written the essays. And I deserved to know why that wasn't enough. The documentary had premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. It told the story of Maya's journey from incarceration to Harvard to becoming an advocate for criminal justice reform. But it also told the broader story of systemic inequality and what it takes to challenge those systems. The documentary had won the Audience Award at Sundance. It had been picked up by a major streaming platform. It had been watched by millions of people around the world. And it had sparked a national conversation about criminal justice, education access, and second chances. Universities had started creating programs similar to what Harvard had done with Maya. Companies had started hiring formerly incarcerated people. Politicians had started proposing legislation to address some of the barriers that people with criminal records faced. It wasn't complete transformation. The systems were still broken in many ways. But there was movement. There was change. 15 years after her admission to Harvard, Maya was sitting in her office at Second Chances. The organization now had a staff of 50 people. They'd helped over 2,000 formerly incarcerated individuals access higher education. They'd become a national model for how to support people with criminal records in rebuilding their lives. A young man came into her office. His name was Deshaun, and he was one of the fellows in their program. He was a formerly incarcerated person who is now studying criminal justice policy at Georgetown University. "I wanted to tell you something," Deshaun had said. "I got accepted to Harvard Law School." Maya had stood up and hugged him. "That's incredible," she'd said. "That's absolutely incredible." "I wouldn't be here without you," Deshaun had said. "Without the work you're doing. Without the doors you've opened. When I was in prison, I didn't think I was ever going to get out. I didn't think I was ever going to be anything. But I read your book. I read your story. And I thought if she can do it, maybe I can too." Maya had cried as she listened to him. "You did it," she'd told him. "I just opened a door. You walked through it. You did the work. You earned this. But I wouldn't have known to even try," Deshaun had said, "if you hadn't shown me that it was possible." Later that day, Maya received an email from Dean Foster. He was 91 years old now, retired for nearly a decade, but he still kept in touch. He'd written to tell her that he was writing a memoir about his time at Harvard. In the memoir, he was planning to devote an entire chapter to the decision to admit her and how that decision had changed his thinking about education and justice. "I want future generations to understand," he'd written, "why that decision mattered. I want them to understand that taking a chance on someone is not charity. It's not being politically correct. It's recognizing that our systems are broken and that sometimes fixing them requires breaking our own rules." He'd ended the email with, "You changed me, Maya. You changed how I understand my role as an educator. You changed how I understand my responsibility to justice. And I'm grateful for that." Maya had written back to Dean Foster immediately. She'd told him that she was grateful for him too. She'd told him that his one decision had rippled through time in ways he probably couldn't even measure. She'd told him that every person she'd helped, every door she'd opened, every young person who'd been given a second chance, all of that was because he'd taken a chance on her. A month later, she'd received a phone call. Dean Foster had died peacefully in his sleep. He was 91 years old. He'd lived a long life. But his greatest legacy, Maya believed, was the decision he'd made to override the admissions committee. At his funeral, Maya had given a eulogy. Dean Foster believed in second chances, she'd said, standing in front of hundreds of people who'd known him throughout his life. He believed that people could change. He believed that institutions could change. He believed that education was a tool for liberation. And he lived his beliefs. He took a chance on a formerly incarcerated black woman from Detroit when everyone else said no. And that one decision changed not just my life, but the lives of thousands of other people. She'd paused, looking at the casket. "I want to promise you, Dean Foster," she'd said, "that I'm going to keep doing this work. I'm going to keep opening doors. I'm going to keep believing in people who have been told they're hopeless. I'm going to keep working toward a world where taking a chance on someone like me is not remarkable. It's standard. It's expected. It's what institutions do because it's the right thing to do." In the years after Dean Foster's death, Maya had intensified her work. She'd published 2 more books. She'd founded a second organization focused on policy advocacy. She'd worked with governments around the world on criminal justice reform. But what she was most proud of was the people. The thousands of people who'd been given second chances. The people who were now doctors and lawyers and teachers and social workers. The people who'd gone through prison and come out the other side transformed. One of those people was a woman named Jennifer. Jennifer had been incarcerated for drug charges. She'd participated in Second Chances program. She'd gone to college. She'd become a social worker. And now she was running a program in her home state helping other incarcerated women. In an interview, Jennifer had said, "Maya showed me that my past doesn't determine my future. She showed me that if I was willing to do the work, if I was willing to change, then society should be willing to give me a chance. And now I spend my life doing that for other people. I spend my life showing other women that they can have a future different from their past." 20 years after her admission to Harvard, Maya was invited back to campus to receive an honorary doctorate. She was also asked to speak at the dedication of the Dean William Foster Center for Criminal Justice Reform, a new research center that had been established at Harvard with funding from Dean Foster's estate. "I'm standing here," Maya had said at the dedication, "as a formerly incarcerated woman who was told that she didn't belong. I'm standing here as a woman who was rejected by this institution and then given a second chance. I'm standing here as a woman who has dedicated her life to making sure that other people get second chances too." She'd looked at the building, a beautiful structure filled with classrooms and offices and spaces designed for research and learning. "And I'm standing here to say that this building, this center, this work, it's not charity," she'd continued. "It's not about making ourselves feel good about helping poor people or people with criminal records. It's about recognizing that our systems are fundamentally unjust. It's about recognizing that we have incarcerated millions of people, disproportionately black people and poor people. It's about recognizing that we need to change that." She'd paused. "But change doesn't happen automatically," she'd said. "Change happens when people decide that the status quo is unacceptable. Change happens when people use their power to open doors. Change happens when institutions like Harvard decide that their responsibility goes beyond educating the already privileged. Change happens when we all decide that everyone deserves a second chance." So here's what I want to ask you in the comments. Do you believe in second chances? Do you think the criminal justice system should be reformed? Do you think institutions like Harvard have a responsibility to help people from marginalized communities? Do you think Dean Foster did the right thing? Rate this story from 0 to 10. Tell me what you think about Maya's journey. Tell me what you think about systemic change and whether it's possible. Tell me what you think you would do if you were in Dean Foster's position. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. Because there are so many stories about people who've been told they don't belong, and some of them find people who believe in them anyway. I'll see you next time.